In the bustling heart of Caladim, a city of silk banners and clanging coin, a thin girl named Lyora darted between merchant stalls, her bare feet whispering against the dusty cobblestones. The sun blazed overhead, glinting off copper pots and gold chains, but she kept her eyes on a single target, a tall, rotund man with a jeweled turban and a beard as black as night. This was Barak, the wealthiest spice merchant in the city, and the man who claimed ownership over her life. She clutched a scrap of bread, her only meal of the day, as Barak's voice boomed, "Lyora, you idle wretch, come here." His tone was sharp as a scimitar, but her mind was sharper still. Lyora's gaze swept the market, calculating her moves. She had survived through quick wit, nimble fingers, and the ability to make herself unseen. But today was different. Today, she decided, the game would change. Barak's stall was a riot of color and scent. Mountains of crimson saffron, golden turmeric, and rich brown cinnamon that made the air hum with spice. Lyora stopped just beyond the reach of his gaze, her fingers brushing the edge of a faded shawl draped over one shoulder. Barak's apprentices bustled around, scooping powders into jars and tying them with twine, their chatter drowning in the clamor of buyers. Lyora's heart pounded, not from fear but from anticipation. She knew the merchant's routines, as well as she knew the worn seams of her own tunic. He was arrogant, certain of his power, and he never expected anyone beneath him to challenge it. "You think you own the market, Barak," she whispered under her breath, "but you've never met someone who can see your blind spots." A gust of wind swept through the market, lifting dust into a shimmering veil. Lyora used the moment to step closer, weaving between a matron buying cumin and a boy balancing a basket of figs. Her small size was an advantage. She slipped into spaces adults ignored. Barak's booming laughter rang out as he greeted a noblewoman draped in peacock blue silk. While his attention was drawn to the glitter of coin, Lyora's sharp eyes caught sight of the merchant's ledger lying open on the counter. In that book lay the details of his trade deals, debts and secrets, information worth more than gold if used wisely. She hesitated only a breath, then drifted closer, her shadow barely touching the sunlit stall. The noblewoman's voice was syrupy sweet as she haggled over saffron, and Barak leaned in with false courtesy. Lyora's fingers itched, her breath steady. She pretended to examine a bundle of dried herbs, her ears tuned to every word, while her mind mapped her escape route. Barak's stall backed onto a narrow alley, one she had memorized since childhood. The alley was cluttered with crates and broken pottery, but it offered shadows, her greatest allies. She let her fingertips brush the ledger's corner, testing his awareness. Nothing. No pause, no glare. A rush of heat flared in her chest. This was her moment. The sound of a dropped jaw shattered the rhythm of the market. An apprentice cursed under his breath as he scrambled to sweep the shards, drawing Barak's attention away for a fraction of a second. Lyora's hand moved like water, fluid, invisible, slipping the ledger into the folds of her shawl. Her heart hammered, but her expression remained calm, almost bored, as she turned toward the alley. Behind her, the merchant's booming voice returned to haggling, oblivious. Lyora stepped into the shadows, her breath finally escaping in a whisper. The game had indeed changed, and for the first time in her life, she held a piece of power in her hands. The alley swallowed Lyora whole, its cool shadows wrapping around her like a secret. The noise of the market faded into muffled echoes as she ducked behind a stack of cracked amphorae. She pulled the ledger from her shawl, its leather warm from the sun, smelling faintly of spice and ink. Every page was dense with curling script, trade routes, names, debts, and symbols she only half understood. Yet certain patterns leapt out at her, numbers that didn't match, debts that were quietly erased, merchants who owed far more than they could pay. "So, Barak," she murmured, "you've built your fortune on lies." She closed the book and tucked it back safely. The first move was hers, but she would need allies to make it count. She made her way deeper into the maze of alleys, until the scent of spice was replaced by the tang of fish and salt. The docks lay ahead, where merchants' goods flowed in and out of Caladim like the tides. Lyora kept to the edges, slipping between piles of cargo and stacks of ropes, scanning for a familiar face. She spotted Jarek, a lanky dockhand with sea-worn skin and eyes quick as gulls. He owed her a favor, a large one. As she approached, Jarek raised an eyebrow. "Haven't seen you in weeks, Lyora. What trouble follows you now?" She smirked. "The kind that can make us both rich, if you can keep your mouth shut." They sat on an overturned barrel, the hum of the harbor around them, creaking wood, shouting sailors, the slap of waves. Lyora laid the ledger across her lap and opened to a marked page. "Barak's been cheating half the merchants in the city," she said, tapping a line of figures. Jarek frowned, his finger tracing the ink. If this is true, the council would ruin him. But they'd need proof they understand. Lyora leaned in, her voice low. "That's why I need you. You know the docks, the merchants, the whispers. Help me gather the rest and I'll make sure Barak's empire crumbles." Jarek's grin was slow, sharp. "Sounds like fun." As evening crept in, the harbor's energy shifted. The sun dipped low, painting the water in molten gold, while the cries of gulls gave way to the murmur of taverns. Jarek led Lyora to a low-roofed building tucked between warehouses. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the scent of strong ale. At a corner table sat Marin, a sharp-eyed woman known for keeping books for half the traders in Caladim. Jarek leaned close to her ear. Marin's gaze flicked to Lyora, cool and measuring. "You've got something worth my time?" she asked. Lyora met her eyes without flinching. "Worth more than time, worth freedom." Marin took the ledger and flipped through its pages, her fingers moving with the speed of someone who could read a man's life in a single glance. "You're right," she murmured. "These numbers are rigged, and not even cleverly. He's gotten sloppy." She closed the book and set it down. "If we move too fast, he'll bury the evidence. Too slow, and he'll suspect." Lyora's jaw tightened. "Then we move just fast enough for him to underestimate us." Jarek chuckled. "And what's our first step?" Lyora's eyes glittered. "We set the trap and let him walk right into it." Night pooled over Caladim like ink, and Lyora moved through it with practiced quiet, the ledger tucked beneath her shawl, as if it were another bone in her ribcage. She and Marin sat by a single guttering candle in the back room of the tavern, quills scratching, numbers bending. Marin said, "We seed a fiction that tastes true," and her eyes flicked to a wax seal she had carved to mimic Barak's crest. Jarek paced, restless energy crackling. Jarek said, "You want whispers on the docks by dawn? I can make sailors swear an oath to a shadow." Lyora smiled, thin and certain. Lyora said, "Then we begin with saffron that never arrives, and debts that mysteriously vanish." They drafted a false invoice, and a letter hinting at a secret shipment, a honeyed lure for a greedy mind. The plan was simple at first glance, intricate in motion. Let Barak hear what he most wanted to believe. Then let the truth tear at the lie from below like a hidden tide. Before dawn, the harbor was a cathedral of ropes and masts, the air salted and cold. Jarek moved from crew to crew, trading jokes and rumor with equal fluency, while Lyora kept to the periphery, marking who listened hardest. Jarek said, "Word is Barak's saffron is skipping the customs scales tonight. Extra barrels, sweet and quiet." And the sailors laughed the way men laugh when they smell coin. Lyora slipped a folded note into a foreman's pocket with the ease of a ghost. Marin, unseen, had already placed a duplicate ledger line with a clerk who cared more for tea than for truth. Lyora's heart thudded in steady beats as the city's appetite woke. Lyora said, "He will chase the scent I choose." She felt it then. The strange power of choosing a world and watching it form. Fragile, bright, and dangerous. And she promised herself she would not blink when it caught fire. By midday the rumor ripened. Barak prowled his stall with a predator's scowl, rings flashing like small suns. A courier in the merchant livery arrived breathless with the forged letter, the wax seal gleaming perfect and poisonous. Barak tore it open, eyes racing, lips curling into a private smile that fooled no one. Barak said at last, "A shipment worthy of my name," and beckoned two apprentices with a jerk of his hand. Lyora, blending with the crowd, watched the trap cinch. She needed him to move fast, to expose the hidden channels he paid to ignore. Marin's counterfeit entries would match what his greed demanded to see. And when he cross-checked, the city's clerks would confirm the same borrowed lie. Lyora said, "He will come to the docks at dusk," and allowed herself a breath, brief and bright, as the first tile of the mosaic settled into place. Dusk smeared bronze across the water when Barak arrived at the docks in a curtained palanquin, impatience rattling like coins in a cup. He dismissed the bearers and strode to a quiet berth named in the letter, only to find barrels banded and sealed under city mark, not his. The harbormaster approached with two guards, bored but alert. Harbormaster said, "Customs, routine," and broke a seal to reveal not saffron, but spoiled grain, sour and useless. Barak's face flushed an ugly whine. Barak said, "This berth was reserved for my private consignment." The harbormaster shrugged, unruffled. Harbormaster said, "That is not what the ledger says." In the shadows, Lyora felt the tremor of the snare tightening. One more turn, she told her racing pulse. One more turn and the teeth close. Jarek shifted beside her, ready to run or to shout, and Maraine's calm gaze weighed the angles like brass on a scale. Barak barked orders and the dockhands scurried, but the air itself resisted him. A clerk arrived with the duplicate entry that Marin had planted, each line a mirror to the forgery he clutched. Clerk said, "Your signature places the consignment here," and the guards shifted, interest stirring. The crowd gathered like crows. Lyora stepped forward just enough to be seen by one of Barak's apprentices, the timid one who always counted wrong. Fear widened his eyes. "Apprentice," said Master, "we never logged saffron today." Panic began to fray the edges of Barak's certainty. He scanned faces, searching for an enemy wearing his own mistake. Lyora said, "Let him follow the thread," her voice no louder than a tide. Tonight he would hunt for a saboteur among his own ranks, and in that frantic search he would reveal every hidden door he used to cheat the city. Freedom, she thought, has the sound of a lock clicking open. The night bled into the market with a restless hum, merchants shuttering stalls while Barak's apprentices scurried like frightened mice. Barak prowled between them, his gold rings glinting in lamplight, voice like gravel dragged over steel. Barak said, "One of you is selling me to my enemies." The younger apprentice stammered, but the elder, a hawk-nosed boy with eyes too steady, met his gaze. Barak's fingers twitched toward the whip hanging at his belt. From the mouth of an alley, Lyora watched the performance. She needed him angry enough to act in haste, desperate enough to make mistakes. Marin's words from the night before whispered in her mind. "A man's greed builds his fortune, but his pride burns it." Lyora knew it was time to feed the fire. Slipping away, Lyora threaded through the sleeping streets toward a cramped scribe's shop. Inside, the air was thick with ink and parchment dust. The old scribe, a stooped man with cataract-clouded eyes, looked up from his work. Scribe said, "You again, little shadow." Lyora set a folded page on the desk. A precise copy of Barak's forged customs entry, with one damning alteration. Lyora said, "This needs to find its way to the council chambers before the week is out." The scribe chuckled, his ink-stained fingers sliding the page into a pile destined for the city messengers. He didn't ask why. He never did. Outside, the wind carried the scent of sea salt and trouble, and Lyora pulled her shawl tighter. The first crack in Barak's armor was on its way to the heart of Kaladim's law. At dawn, the council square filled with the clatter of hooves and the murmurs of petitioners. Lyora lingered by a stone fountain, keeping her profile low as a clerk in green robes, unrolled the day's docket. Arrived in a gilded carriage, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes flicked over every face like a blade seeking its sheath. Lyora tracked his movements, noting the council guard's disinterest, a sign he had not yet been accused, but the seeds were planted. She would let him stew in uncertainty, until his temper pushed him into the open. Jarek joined her, leaning casually against the fountain's edge. Jarek said, "You look like a cat at a mouse hole." Lyora replied, "Hell comes sniffing soon enough." By midday, Barak's anger was an unchained beast. He stormed through the docks, barking orders to his men, overturning crates in search of phantom contraband. Merchants whispered in corners, their eyes bright with the scent of scandal. In the shadows of a warehouse, Lyora, Jarek, and Marin studied the chaos. Marin said, "He's thrashing too soon. We may not even need the council." Lyora shook her head. Lyora said, "No, this ends in the open where everyone sees him fall." Jarek grinned. "And how do you plan to drag him there?" Lyora's smile was thin as a blade. "I'll give him something to chase that he can't resist, proof of a betrayal that doesn't exist." That night, in a room above the tavern, Lyora laid out the bait. A sealed packet containing evidence of an apprentice's deal with a rival merchant, forged in Marin's perfect hand. Jarek would slip it into Barak's private storeroom, and word would be left for one of the apprentices to accidentally discover it. The trick was timing. Barak had to find it himself, in the presence of others, so his reaction would be public and loud. Lyora traced the edge of the seal with her fingertip, her mind steady despite the pounding in her chest. Lyora said, "When he opens this, he'll think he's hunting a traitor, but he'll be walking straight into the council's jaws." The morning broke sharp and clear, light glinting off the tiled roofs, as Jarek slipped through the merchant quarter with a bundle under his arm. The streets were waking. Apprentices fetching water, shutters opening, smells of bread and cumin drifting through the air. Jarek entered Barak's storeroom through the side door he'd bribed a porter to leave unlatched. Inside, rows of crates and chests stood like silent sentries. He found the lacquered coffer where Barak kept his private papers and slid the sealed packet into the stack. No sound but his own breath and the soft creak of wood. As he left, he whispered to himself, "Hooks in." Across the street, Lyora leaned against a wall, shawl drawn close, watching the door. The air was bright with the promise of collision. By midday, the storeroom hummed with activity. Barak's apprentices hauled sacks and tallied stock, the elder boy fetching the coffer at Barak's barked order. When the packet emerged, its seal catching the sunlight, the younger apprentice frowned. Barak snatched it, eyes narrowing at the crest of a rival merchant. He tore it open, scanning the forged confession, his face tightening into a storm. Barak said, "So this is how you repay me." The apprentices exchanged confused glances. Already his voice was rising. A crowd began to gather outside the stall, sensing the scent of blood. Lyora, half hidden among them, kept her eyes fixed on Barak's every move. The louder he became, the deeper he sank into the snare. Barak stormed from his stall, clutching the letter like a weapon, and marched toward the council square. His apprentices trailed behind, voices raised in protest, but he was deaf to reason. Lyora and Jarek melted into the stream of onlookers following him. The cobbled streets rang with his fury. At the square, guards straightened as he approached, demanding audience with the councilors. His words tumbled out, accusations, betrayal, theft, while he waved the evidence high. Lyora noted how the gathered crowd leaned in, how whispers grew like dry leaves in the wind. This was the stage she had wanted. Barak at the center, every eye on him, his pride doing the work her hands could not. Inside the council chamber, the air was cool and still. The walls hung with heavy tapestries depicting Kaladim's history. Councilors in green and gold robes sat in a half-circle, their expressions sharpening as Barak's accusations spilled forth. The head councilor raised a hand. Head councilor said, "Do you have corroboration?" Barak thrust the letter forward. A clerk stepped forward, unrolling the ledger entry Marin had forged, its figures matching Barak's own records. The trap was perfect, too neat, too convenient, and entirely of his own making. Lyora, standing at the chamber's edge among petitioners, watched the first flicker of doubt cross the head councilor's face. The silence that followed was thick as honey. When the head councilor spoke again, his voice was measured, but the undertone was steel. Head counselor said, "We will investigate this matter thoroughly." It was not the victory Barak had expected. It was a summons into the council's gaze, where every stone of his dealings could be turned. He bowed stiffly, his eyes scanning the chamber until they caught on Lyora's face. Recognition flared there, but uncertainty dulled its edge. She held his gaze just long enough to plant the thought, "I am not afraid of you." Outside, the market's noise rushed back in as the council doors closed. Jarek murmured, "He's on the hook now." Lyora replied, "And the current is strong." The following morning, council scribes fanned through the market like crows, parchment and quills in hand, asking quiet, precise questions. Merchants answered with the politeness of those who feared both truth and punishment. Barak sat behind his stall, a carved smile fixed in place, but his eyes darted to every scribe. Lyora watched from across the street, a basket of figs in her arms to disguise her intent. She could see the tension in his hands, the way he tapped his rings against the table. Jarek sidled up beside her, murmuring, "He's bleeding inside." She replied without looking away, "Not enough yet, we need him to run." And she already knew the path she'd drive him down, a path lit by greed and shadow. That night, in the back room of the tavern, Maraine spread a map of Kaladim's southern docks across the table. Her finger traced a narrow inlet where smugglers avoided customs' eyes. Marin said, "If he thinks he's about to lose everything, he'll try to move his most valuable goods through here." Lyora leaned over the map, memorizing every turn. Jarek poured ale into 3 chipped mugs. Lyora said, "We'll leak word of a secret buyer waiting at that inlet with more coin than sense. He'll bite." Marin's eyes narrowed. "And if he smells the trap?" Lyora's voice was steady. "Then we vanish into the dark before his shadow catches ours." The rumor began before dawn. A whisper in the fish market. A muttered conversation on the docks. By midday, it had grown legs and walked straight into Barak's ear. Lyora shadowed him at a distance, noting the subtle stiffening of his spine when 2 sailors mentioned a gold-drunk buyer at the inlet. His hand went to his beard, stroking as he weighed risk against hunger. Later, she watched him send one apprentice away with a sealed note, the boy vanishing into the maze of streets. Jarek murmured beside her, "He's moving." She allowed herself a slow breath. Good. Once he's in the inlet, he won't have the council to hide behind. Twilight painted the inlet in violet and gold. Small waves lapped at the pilings where a lone skiff bobbed, tied and waiting. Lyora crouched in the shadow of an abandoned warehouse with Jarek, eyes fixed on the narrow dock. Footsteps echoed on the planks, heavy and certain. Barak, flanked by 2 men carrying chests. He paused, scanning the empty water. Barak said, "Where is this buyer?" His voice was low, sharp with suspicion. Lyora's pulse pounded in her ears, but she held still. She needed him to call attention to himself, to be caught in the act by the right eyes. And those eyes were already moving closer through the dark. From the far side of the inlet, lantern light flared as council guards stepped into view, their boots ringing on the planks. The harbor master's voice carried over the water. Harbor master said, "Barak of Kaladim, you will account for this shipment." Barak spun, fury and alarm battling across his face. His men froze, chests still in hand. Lyora rose from the shadows, letting him see her silhouette in the lamplight. His mouth opened, but no words came. She said, "You should have checked your ledgers more carefully." Guards moved in, surrounding the dock. The current she had set in motion was now roaring, and there was no way for him to swim against it. Barak's voice thundered across the inlet, demanding explanations, but the guards were unmoved. The harbor master gestured, and one of the chests was pried open, revealing silks, spices, and coin, all marked for undeclared trade. Gasps rippled through the watching dock hands. The lead guard said, "You stand accused of smuggling and falsifying council records." Barak's face paled beneath his beard. Lyora watched from the edge of the dock, her hands hidden in her shawl, her gaze locked on his. He had built his fortune on lies, and now every eye in Caladim could see the rot. Pride had brought him here. Pride would sink him. The council arrived within the hour, their green and gold robes catching the flicker of torchlight. The head councillor stepped forward, voice carrying easily over the murmurs. Head councillor said, "Barak of Caladim, you will forfeit your goods and stand trial before the full assembly." Barak's protest was a choked snarl, his gaze sweeping the crowd until it found Liora. Recognition lit his eyes, but it was too late. She stood unmoving, the council's authority wrapping her like armor. Around them, the dockworkers muttered, their loyalty already shifting like the tide. The city would remember this night, the night a merchant prince fell in front of his people. At dawn, word of Barak's arrest rolled through Caladim faster than the morning tide. His stall stood empty, shutters drawn tight, the scent of saffron already fading from the air. Liora walked through the market without hurry, the stares of merchants sliding over her like rain over stone. Jarek appeared at her side, a crooked grin on his face. Jarek said, "So what now? You're free." She paused, letting the words settle. Free. Him divined. No master's voice calling her name like a curse. No debt she could never repay. She turned toward the rising sun. Liora said, "Now I decide where I go." Later that day, in the quiet of the tavern, Marin placed a small purse of coin on the table between them. Marin said, "Your share." Liora pushed it back. Liora said, "Use it to keep the others fed. I have enough." Marin studied her for a long moment before nodding. Outside, the streets bustled, but here the air was still, heavy with the smell of wood and ale. Jarek raised his mug in salute. Jarek said, "To the girl who outsmarted a merchant prince." Liora shook her head. Liora said, "To the next game." As night fell, Liora stood on the city walls, the lights of Caladim flickering below like scattered gold. The sea stretched beyond, black and endless, the wind tugging at her braid. Behind her lay the market, the alleys, the debts, the life she had been forced to live. Ahead lay nothing certain, and for the first time, that uncertainty felt like a gift. She thought of Barak, locked away, and felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of a door closing. Liora said to the wind, "I am my own." And with that, she stepped down from the wall, into the maze of streets that were now hers to navigate.